Hello and welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist and partner here at TCS, and I want to thank each of you for being here today. I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, Etosha Thurman. Etosha, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
So Etosha is the Chief Marketing and Solutions Officer at the Intelligence Spend and Business Network at SAP. Did I get it all in?
You got it perfectly. It's perfect. Exactly what I am.
And we'll break that down here in just a minute. So Etosha, where are you calling in from today?
I am calling in from sunny and hot Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh my. We're here in Boise, Idaho, and we're just getting the first, I would say, cool temperatures. It's still 80, but it's getting into the 50s and high 40s at night. So you can see what's coming in the near future here with cooler evenings and cooler days. So let's just jump into it, Etosha. Again, I'm so thankful that you were able to take some time from your busy schedule to join us today and talk about some really interesting things because, you're involved in travel, you're involved in supply chain of all kinds. You're involved in staffing and just the use of contract employees, all of these things which are hugely impacted by COVID and all kinds of things. So we're going to jump into it here. How have you seen spend management evolve over the last 10 years, Etosha?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say, I think there's a separation point there called February 2020. So maybe let's talk about the 8 years before that and what's happened in the 2 years after the start of the pandemic. I think in the 8 years before, right, if you say 2012 to 2020, what we saw in spend management was more of a focus on operational procurement, really. Companies have been doing strategic procurement for a while. So with strategic procurement, that's more around focusing on getting the right sources of supply, contracting with suppliers, being sure you have suppliers under contract. And then when you think about operational procurement, it's the steps after I have them under contract. How do I ensure that the purchase orders match up to the contracts, that I'm paying the suppliers, our vendors for the things that we have on contract? You saw a rise in being able to think about differentiated working capital management opportunities with suppliers, between buyers and suppliers. What I would say is, companies were really focused on continuing their digital transformation as it relates to strategic procurement and operational procurement. And now everything's great, right? We've been doing this for years. Procurement has been a very steady function, in particular, even though when I think spend, I think of supply chain, procurement, planning, logistics, and accounts payable all in. But in particular, procurement has been a very stable function up until the pandemic. Right. And then the pandemic hits. And I've said this before, I'll say this now, we can't get toilet paper. Right. So all of a sudden, the supply chain is very real and present, not just in business, but in our own personal lives. That spend management function with those different pieces of the overall spend management function, our profession that I mentioned, had to kick into, reactionary gear. How do I look at my supply chains? What is the capacity of my suppliers? Do I have visibility into the challenges they have? I know their capacity, but hey, I don't know their suppliers' capacity or their suppliers' capacity, where you saw that. A great example of what we call nth tier supply chain issues, semiconductors, right? Where most companies that when we think about semiconductors, they understood their direct suppliers' challenges or capacity status, but maybe not their suppliers or their suppliers. And what happened was we found out there was a lot of fragility in supply chain. There is a lot of, I'm going to say, clouded transactions happening where I don't have visibility into the drivers of how you're servicing me or how I'm servicing you. And it impacted everything from being able to actually buy goods and services, to being able to ship goods and services, to being able to have labor available to receive or even deliver goods and services. It's been a perfect storm. And the thing that's changed is, one, the importance of that spend management function has elevated significantly over the last 2.5 years, right? There were CEOs who had no idea what the procurement team did, had no idea they had a logistics team, right? Because that was just part of supply chain. I don't understand the components, who now have conversations with their CPO, who now ask very diverse questions of their chief supply chain officers. You've had the procurement function in particular pulled up into strategic conversations with their business partners. Like, how do we diversify where we have our supply located? Because of the risk we have of having like a power region where we're sourcing from, look what's happened. So how do we diversify geographically? How do we intentionally source to help us with CSR goals? Or specifically, how can we source to help us with logistics in our carbon footprint? So, the role of spend management has elevated within most companies because it's been a big flashlight that was shined on the supply chains of yesterday, which found lots of cracks and faults. And I think the last trend I would say that we see is maybe an acceleration of the digitization of those spend management processes, whether that is collaborative planning, being able to actually not just plan in isolation, but plan collaboratively with your supply chain, whether that's strategic procurement, really looking at how am I sourcing? Do I have a plan for my key materials and services that I deliver to the market? Whether that's operational procurement, man, we couldn't pay people fast enough. We couldn't hire people. We didn't have a contingent labor strategy. So there's definitely been an acceleration of digitization to support these processes and an elevation of those processes in and of itself within companies across the world.
Wow. Is it a labor shortage that is backing up everything because COVID is making people sick, or they're getting, they're not willing to go to work because they're frontline people? So I had all these questions about where are the bottlenecks that happened as a result of COVID. And I don't know if there's one answer that fits all of that, but it certainly was a point of discussion with all of us. Good news, though, my wife had toilet paper under contract. I'm serious. She went out and found this environmentally sound toilet paper made of bamboo and has boxes automatically delivered on a schedule. And this was before COVID. So, we were sitting pretty.
Well, I know I did
before toilet paper went under because of my wife's foresight.
She was smarter than me because I definitely did the drive around several different, stores in the Atlanta area. It was so bad. We had a text chain. Clorox wipes here,
Oh boy.
Here. Yeah, because it was really bad. But you ask what started it. It's such a good question. And there's many different philosophies and theories out there. I think one thing you could think about, though, is that's a contributor, definitely not, I don't think there's any one single factor that we can say, this is it. I think it was a multitude. But one of it is over the last, you said the last 10 years. Let's go back 20 years, right? Companies have been moving to just-in-time inventories, right? When I started, and it was more, I won't say when I started, but when I started at P&G a while ago in strategic sourcing, one of the things we talked to our suppliers are, how much inventory can you carry? We don't want to carry it. You carry. We need you to carry this much inventory to keep our lines running. And that process, continued to refine itself to a well-oiled machine, or so we thought. But what happens when that machine has to shut down? A component of that has to shut down. If I have just-in-time inventory, I might be carrying 2 weeks, but if I have to shut down for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, how do I catch up?
Right.
And then I don't have visibility. I don't have visibility into how long it takes you to get me that, because we haven't been sharing, capacity plans.
Right.
Maybe. but we surely haven't been doing it in an agile function. And then another thing that happened. So first of all, I had to shut down. So my just-in-time cycle is off. And then wait a minute, these pesky things called consumers had these wild swings in what they wanted, right?
Etosha, can you just imagine that you're a lifelong toilet paper supply chain guy, right? Right? And there is nothing in your world that would tell you that demand is going to quadruple instantly.
In a month. Exactly. Exactly. Just think about this. Is what I say all the time, that with a change in procurement is a once in a generation occurrence. A function doesn't change this much like this in such a short amount of time. It just doesn't typically happen. But exactly, you can imagine toilet paper consumption is pretty consistent. And now all of a sudden it's skyrocketed, probably like we found out, mostly out of fear. But how do I adjust my systems that fast? How do I translate? And this is a real problem even right now for so many of our companies out there. How do I, one, have enough indices out there to give me a good sense of consumer sentiment that I can feed into my planning process so that I know where demand may be going? But once I understand that, how do I feed that insight then into my supply chain? And then they can feed it into their supply chain. So we have this agile, transparent, I don't know who coined this term. I first read it in the Wall Street Journal, but this supply web, not supply chain. How do I have this agile supply web that goes not just to my direct suppliers, but to the nth tier supplier, where we're really smart about that consumer sentiment, and we can be dynamic and responsive to what we're seeing throughout the process. So that's a very different thought than just in time. Because just in time is I have predictable, consistent demand, and you know how much I'm going to need, give or take, plus or minus, whatever percent. And that's what we managed to.
Wow. And that's a good segue into my next question here. So we here at TCS, we talk to a lot of, executive teams out there about the future. And it seems like today, everyone is wanting to talk about ecosystems. So they're saying, okay, how are ecosystem business models different from vertical industries and just traditional business structures out there? Is this just hype, or is this something different there? So are you hearing the same thing? Are people talking about ecosystems in a way that they never did 5 years ago?
I think so. I definitely I'm hearing about ecosystems and being able to create an ecosystem around your core strength, right, as a business. I don't know, everything old is new again. I don't know that this is a brand new model, but I think it goes back to that supply web concept of, supply chains are linear, but there's some things that are outside of my core competency that still impacts my ability to be successful, right? So I need to be mindful, if I'm a chip retailer, I need to be mindful of what's happening with those key raw ingredients, right? My ecosystem might need to be broader than what I thought if I keep it in the spend management realm. When you think software, like SAP, we, of course, absolutely focus on the ecosystem model. There are some things that we at SAP, your core processes, no one handles better than SAP. Helping you run the core processes of your business, and then the functional excellence that we deliver through our extensions like Ariba with procurement, success factors with HR, platform, and this is it, platform technology with BTP. And for us, that platform technology is part of how we are allowing our customers to be able to say what's their core and what ecosystem plays do they need to bring in. And so the idea is, if I take it to not a technology realm, I'll take it to a consumer products realm when I think ecosystem. I recently listened to an interview that was done with, and I can't remember his name, forgive me for this, but it was the CEO of Lego who took over when they were having some difficulty as a business. And he said he came in and was assessing the state of Lego. And he said, a lot of mature companies don't die of starvation. They die of indigestion, where they've taken on so much more than their core. It's hard to consume everything they're doing. And the concept of ecosystem model is that I stay true to my core and I build partnerships or I allow outside external participants to deliver adjacent value on top of my core without me having to own that value or own the delivery of that value. And so I don't think it's necessarily new, but I think that consumption problem, that indigestion, is something that a lot of companies are struggling with and are starting to pull back and let me focus on my core value that I'm bringing to the market and finding ways to deliver extensions of that value through the ecosystem.
That's just brilliant. We're seeing very similar kinds of things out there. So let's go back and talk about the supply chain just one more time and just the aspect of it. Because what's most interesting post-COVID now, let's talk about that. In the future, will we look back and see the pandemic as a catalyst for change in the supply chain? Will we look back and say, that was post-COVID and everything's different? What do you think will be the long-term transformation that we all experience as a result of the pandemic?
Wow. I mean, so many places to start, right? So I'll touch on my areas, right? I'll touch on them each individually and then maybe collectively just overall as consumers in business. So if I think about will we look back and see change? Absolutely, without a doubt. I think there's been a fundamental change for a lot of things. And let me first start with travel. So as you know, my scope of responsibility includes spend management under SAP, which includes SAP Concur, the leading travel and expense solution in the market, right? And what do we see? Pandemic hits, what do people stop doing? Traveling. For me personally, this was quite a stressful reality. I have been traveling since I graduated from college. And right. And at the time, I wasn't at SAP. I was at a different company leading a sales team, right? And now I have to be home. And it was just wild. I'd been married 20 something years. I never stayed home that long, ever. Yeah. And so that was quite an adjustment. But business travel ceased. Right. And I don't know that it's picking up vigorously. Right. But people are being so much more choiceful than before. They're having the idea of, is this worth me getting on the road?
That's
we did research, we have research that said that employees prefer companies that allow them to decide the value of travel. And then what's also interesting is with that pause, people are being more thoughtful about when I travel, how does this impact the carbon footprint of my company? So is this really something I need to do in person? Now, I believe there's always a place for face-to-face business and always will be. But I think one long-standing impact of the pandemic that we will see is not the foregone conclusion that I need to get on a plane. And we're seeing that play out in our research. And in the insight that business travelers are asking to be provided to support them making a decision of whether or not they should travel. So that's travel. If we think about procurement, I've talked about already how that function has really elevated to become part of, they were already very key with cost savings, being one of the main value drivers that the business saw from procurement. But we've seen an expansion of those value drivers, of course, some logically, risk management, supply assurance, but also, strategic influence into imperatives such as I mentioned earlier, what should be our geographic strategy for where we locate source, right? How can we improve our carbon footprint through the suppliers, the supply chain that we build? These are conversations and views that procurement in the past haven't had. And I think the more that procurement function leans into these strategic initiatives and conversations, the more they'll be pulled in. Like an emerging one is procurement being part of how do we ensure we have enough labor to be able to meet demand, where we're complementing our full-time resources with a very robust, very well negotiated contingent labor strategy. So it's super interesting to see how the remit of procurement is changing. And then you have external workforce itself. To your point, was it that people wanted to stay home, that they were afraid of being sick or getting sick? I think all of those things are true. But the other thing that the pandemic did is it caused all of us to pull up and think about how we're living. right? How are we living and how do we want to live? And we've heard about the great resignation and for some the great regret.
Yes.
But all of that was about employees taking power for how they want to work. And for some, being a part of the contingent workforce is a way of life, like the digital nomad. I don't want to be your full-time employee. I want to choose when and where and how I work. And I don't think that trend is going away. And so for the companies that can harness not just full-time employees, but also create these work environments that are supportive of that workforce that wants to be contingent, that can manage the services workforce that needs to come in and support, the more that they look at that as a strategic approach, the more differentiated and successful those companies can be, with seeing labor as an asset that should be part of strategic planning.
No,
and the last one I'll bring up, I'm sorry, Kevin, is business network for us, which is B2B collaboration. And I don't think we could have manufactured a scenario to better show why working outside of the four walls of your business, having transparency and collaboration outside of the four walls of your business is so important. I mean, I've been working with networks and B2B collaboration for over 20 years. And I don't think that there's been a moment in time that has been more poignant in saying how important that is for resiliency and for flexibility than what happened with the pandemic. And I think you will see an explosion of opportunity and processes that really extend that visibility and collaboration outside of one singular entity and be really multi-enterprise processes and collaboration.
I have in the community that we live in here in Boise, so many of my neighbors, they all work for Silicon Valley companies and everything else, where Boise's, a 1 hour or 90-minute flight from San Francisco. So a lot of people work there, but live here, that kind of environment. And some of my neighbors, they've been sick like 3 times. And what goes through my mind is, I hope their sick leave actually covers that, because they're being asked to fly and yet they're getting sick constantly. I hope that's not like digging into their vacation time. I could see companies having to rethink all those kind of HR benefits and everything if they're putting people back on the road as well.
Yeah, and this is actually, again, going back to the research that we did within SAP Concur. That was one of the things too about, it was I wish I could remember the stat off the top of my head. We could get it to you later, but it's a significant percentage of employees that said, if I'm concerned with my health, I don't want to travel. And I want to have the flexibility to decide when I travel. And then even staying in that vein, there was a significant percentage that they would leave their job, their employer, if they didn't allow them to have more say in their travel schedule. And I have to tell you, that is a change. That was definitely not the case or the view before the pandemic. That's part of your job. It wasn't like you really felt like, hey, I'm prioritizing my health. I can tell you how many times I was on a plane and got sick on the plane because somebody was hacking, and I got the flu or a cold.
Yeah.
And, it exited the plane with a gift. That I
know. It's a different world out there. So everywhere we turn, Etosha, we're reading about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So talk to me about where you see artificial intelligence playing a role in spend management.
It's such a good question. There's so many applications. I think, sticking true to my original roots, which is probably I'm biased. I think there's a couple of places I'll call out. Well, I won't. I'll start with not my roots. I'll start with expense management. Already we're leveraging AI and ML to reduce the burden of expense management. Like if you're an employee and you did travel, being able to fill out the expense report is just so much fun. But with a solution like Concur, where we do leverage AI, there's that predictive understanding of where you typically park, how far you typically go to park, where and that can really leverage AI to make it where you have to do the bare minimum to submit your expense report, and then check and be sure that everything you have meets regulatory guidelines and compliance. So, the idea there is how do we give time back to the employees to do the things they're hired to do, but also ensure the compliance that the CFO needs to validate and confirm that business travel happened according to the rules and is being expensed that way. So it's really exciting, and we have a lot planned where we're continuing to strengthen AI in that area. And then I think for procurement, one of the things that's super exciting is about how do you make operational procurement continue to go away, the need for a person to do the tasks of operational procurement. How do you continue to make that go away? Now, we already leverage AI in things like invoice validation and contract validation. We have a partner with iCertis that does smart authoring of contracts. It's just so many ways where we can look at how the business runs and the profile of that business. That's the machine learning piece, and then serve back insights and guidance on what to execute and how to just bring more efficiency to our companies. And I think what I'm most excited about and then I'm going to my roots of sourcing, is how we can leverage AI to help with supply selection, to help identify sources of supply that you may not be able to find because the world is vast. And so really leveraging AI and ML to see, hey, these are the types of things you source. Here's the areas where you tend to need those. Here's sources of supply that exist on the web or in different networks that you may not be aware of, that I can bring into your supplier community to fulfill your needs. It's great. And thinking about personalized sourcing recommendations and personalized strategic procurement task management. This is the way I see AI going. And then, of course, there's the whole low code, no code trend, which means how do I leverage AI to take away your need to decide, right, how to route something, your need to decide approval processes, where we can build a model that leverages what we've already seen and leverages that intelligence to make those baseline decisions and only serve up the strategic tasks for you. If you think about spend management, right, the history of spend management is very task-oriented and very iterative, right? Because what you're doing is planning decides what we're going to build, and then they send those instructions to, and I'm thinking of a manufacturing facility because that was my route, but it's not so different in financial services, where you're thinking about where instead of planning, it's like the bankers are deciding what services the market needs, and then you think about what providers need to come in to allow you to differentiate your services. So not so different, but there's a lot of handoff points, and then iterative processes. Is this the right supplier for this? Did they do what we agreed? Did the invoice come in as we agreed? Did we pay as we agreed? Those things can all be connected and be very efficient, become even more efficient. And then based off of the choices made in the past, really leverage insights both within your company, and then if you leverage networks, like the SAP Business Network within the broader community, to help you be really strategic and intelligent in the decisions you're making in terms of how you spend, where you spend, how you approve, where you route, where you don't route. I can just see the professionals that work in spend management becoming more and more strategic as those operational tasks are handled through AI.
And they're certainly being asked to be more strategic today. Absolutely.
This last 2.5 years have really demanded more of a strategic engagement, less of a transactional engagement. But we have to create the bandwidth within the spend management industry to free that capacity up to be more strategic. And that's why, SAP is leaning into AI ML to be able to free these amazing professionals up to think about those big problems that we have, like sustainability, like diversified sourcing to help build communities and wealth in different areas. The more that we can help them free up those professionals to think about those big problems of now and tomorrow, the better off we'll all be.
Oh, yeah. So talk to me about how risk management is going to evolve given our recent experiences with the pandemic.
Well, I think the biggest one I've already talked about, right? And it's the need to have insight into the nth tier of your supply chain.
Yeah.
Because this is where the fragility came out of the supply chain. It wasn't that companies weren't doing their jobs, right? And when you have a catastrophic event like the pandemic, you realize just how susceptible you are to the risk all the way through your chain. Look, if you're not starting to think about your nth tier supplier risk, you're just setting yourself up for continued disruption to your business, right? And so I think that's one impact from the pandemic we're going to continue to see, and we're going to continue to see demand for solutions that help me have that collaboration, have that insight, further up my supply chain.
Yeah, so let's talk about that at a tactical level. How would you do that? I mean, you can't put somebody on the street chasing down all those different tiers of suppliers. Are there partners or services or something that does that?
Well, let me think. There's this thing called SAP Business Network. And one of the beautiful things that SAP Business Network does is you can be both. I mean, we're about companies showing up as they are, buyers and suppliers, and then allowing them to have transparency in their relationships as a buyer or as a supplier or as a supplier's supplier. And so we're really focused on how do we continue to build this multi-enterprise network where you can see multiple tiers of your supply chain and you can share as far or as condensed as you want within that supply chain. So, I mean, I don't know how without technology do you do this efficiently. I don't think when I was, many moons ago, when I started, sourcing, this was unfathomable. It was unfathomable. It was just even discovery of supply was such a different process. I mean, let's just talk about that, right? Let's just talk about that for a minute, because when I tell people the radical change that has happened since I entered this function and what it is today, when I entered in this spend management space, I looked up Thomas Registry and I went through literally the directory to try to find suppliers of materials. I ordered from a publication called Chem Data because I bought some chemicals to see who were the manufacturers of the types of things that I needed. And then I would call them and say, hey, do you make this? I mean, it would take me months to even get to the specialization I needed. Something that you can do in minutes today on a business network. Not only find the supply, but then invite them to an RFP for your actual need. It's just mind-boggling to me, the compression of time within this, in particular, within the sourcing function of being able to identify supply, being able to understand the capability, being able to RFP and award compared to when I started in this space, just, a few years ago. So I think, just coming back to how do you get there, I think it's only going to be technology that's going to provide the platform for the collaboration. And then it's going to be up to companies to say, I want to engage. Yes, procurement, spend management, they're going to always be responsible for cost savings, for supply assurance, and for mitigating risk and driving, operational efficiency. That will always be key value drivers for spend management as a function, the overall function. But I think you're seeing an elevation also of setting your company up, creating an environment to be the buyer of choice or the supplier of choice, depending on the role that you're playing. And that happens with collaboration and transparency.
So companies everywhere are struggling with all the challenges that we talked about here. But most companies are also wanting to be a purpose-driven and viewed as a purpose-driven company, one that respects everything from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and all these things. They really do want to do that, but then they're struggling with all these big challenges. How are you seeing companies actually not just promote themselves as being purpose-driven, but how are you seeing them actually being purpose-driven out there within these spend areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things that's true is you do see demand, especially Gen Z. I mean, they're all over it. Like, why do you exist? I expect companies I shop with to be thinking about their carbon footprint. I expect them to be thinking about diversity in where they buy. I'm expecting them to, be accountable for helping us have, a better community, so to speak, a better world. And so it's very interesting to see the activism that Gen Z is pushing into global business. And so some of the things that they're asking, I don't know how you do without spend management professionals. At the minimum, to give you choice for who you choose to do business with based off of the purpose that you've set forth. If you're saying that, as an example, there's many governments that say, and if you want to do business with us, you need to have a certain percentage of diverse suppliers within your supply chain, whether that's women businesses or minority businesses or vet businesses, or depending on the country, it can mean indigenous business, it can mean different things. And so think about that. How do I do that? What function helps me find supply? Spend management, right? What function can help me set a performance target with my suppliers for what their footprint looks like? Maybe that's spend management professionals, right? So this is part of where that pandemic shifted how procurement, how supply chain, how logistics professionals, how accounts payable professionals were looked, especially procurement professionals, in what the business is asking for them. It's not just go get me the best cost. It is go find the right choice to help me meet these goals. Because otherwise, I'm just greenwashing, right?
Yeah.
I'm just telling a story, and I'm not actually pivoting how I spend. And this is why we call ourselves intelligent spend, right? We want to help you spend intelligently to deliver your business goals.
Oh, that's awesome. Let me give you a view into a routine here in my house.
Okay.
My wife, she likes to order things from companies that are purpose-driven and that are doing the right things. But lately, I hear these yelling from the kitchen when she sees the packaging. She wants to see them deliver all the way through from the product to the packaging. Yeah, this is pretty funny.
Yeah, and I think you see that demand starting to trigger. I know sometimes when I do some online shopping with some people, they ask me, do you want us to deliver this as fast as possible, or do you want us to consolidate this so we make less trips and be better for the environment? And I know I've said, okay, I don't need it tomorrow. I have to say, during the pandemic, I got really spoiled. Tomorrow.
I know it.
Right? So I'm definitely backing off of that. And, I'll say this one thing that I left SAP for a couple of years. I know you know that. And upon returning, one thing that was pleasant to see as I came back was just the commitment, some of the changes that the company had made to really start to live our sustainability goals. Like, not that we weren't before, but really in small things, like there are no straws, right? They sort of took the straws away, but that's okay. I have a metal straw, so I'm good,
We've got like 20 of those in the house.
But I can adjust, or having those plant-based silverware, right? It's, which I guess isn't silver, but utensils, I'll call it, right? To be able to not leverage single-use plastics. So I love that. And it helps when companies, set the example and really, as uncomfortable as it is to change, force you out of some of your old habits to really better embrace this, in particular, sustainability, where we're trying to go.
Oh, yeah. So let's put on our futurist hat, Natasha.
All right.
Let's look ahead 5-10 years. How is procurement and spend going to change as a profession during that time?
I think that procurement is going to get even closer to planning to the customer. I mean, it already is in so many ways, but I think you're going to see even further collapse of those, or maybe collaboration of those functions, right? Really closer partnership. And I think that's part of it. I think you're going to see procurement be a closer partner to sales, to planning, to the CHRO, the HR function, because what they bring to bear is that expertise in negotiating and that expertise in finding supply and being able to develop supply relationships, which I think is one of the most underrated skills that procurement brings, and that's being able to develop stellar relationships with key suppliers. And then I think what you're going to see too is I think logistics is going to continue to become more and more of a strategic topic within companies, right? I don't think the challenges that were revealed with the Ever Given or with the labor shortages that happened at the ports, with truck drivers, with trains, I don't think that those things are really going to go away. I think what you're going to see is a continued focus on having really good logistics management talent in companies to really think about what are our right transportation lanes, how do we bring more flexibility and agility into how we think about logistics, and how that understanding partners with how we source, and where we source. And so I think in 5 years, you're going to really see those functions being much more cerebral and strategic, less tactical and execution focused, which I think technology will start taking over those, and being more input into how overall business runs.
Thank you for sharing that. So before I let you go, Etosha, if somebody wants more information on all the intelligent spend aspects of SAP, what should they look up? What are the names they should type into Google?
Sure. SAP Ariba for procurement, SAP Fieldglass for anything related to external workforce or services procurement, SAP Concur for travel and expense. And of course, if you're looking to better understand B2B collaboration, there's no better business network than the SAP Business Network.
All right. Etosha, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.